Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Top 5 series for Ryerson's alumni and friends. My name is Christian Mehta, and I am the AVP of Engagement at the university. Before we begin, I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the nature and people who lived on the land that was taken from them and where Ryerson is located today. At the university, we have made important commitments to reconciliation and decolonization, and I invite you to learn more about this work online and in person next time we can get together on campus. So we know you've got a lot on the go. This is just a 30-minute webinar. We're going to dive in quickly, but before I introduce our presenter to you, I have a few housekeeping tips to share. In about 20 minutes, Lisa will be taking your questions. If you want to ask her something, please add your question to Zoom's Q&A area. Your cameras and mics are off, so I'll be selecting questions from there. We're also recording this session, so if you want to rewatch it or share it with your networks, please look for a message from us in your inbox over the next day or two. Okay, so on to today's speaker. Lisa Levesque is an assessment librarian, liaison librarian for journalism, communication and culture, and RTA media, broadcasting, and sports media at Ryerson. Her research focuses on the ways that infrastructure shapes human action, especially in online environments. Recently, she conducted research which includes a practical guide to evaluative literacy skills, theoretical research on how early career professionals navigate systems of power, and qualitative studies on research habits and library services. Lisa, thank you so much for being here with us today. It's over to you now. Let's talk how to identify fake news.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'll share my screen. Can we all see that okay? Good, Christian? Yes?
Yep,
wonderful. I can see it. Awesome. All right. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you everyone for attending. I'm excited to talk to you today because fake news is a real and pressing problem. So this is a photo from April of Queen's Park protesters who are denying that the pandemic is real, which of course it is, and deadly. And since April, we've seen a lot more instances of fake news from people who are against wearing masks for all kinds of dubious reasons, to government officials who can't grapple with the reality that they're supposed to legislate and work within, to you know, everyone who sort of denies public health concerns and is anti-vaccine, even before we have a COVID vaccine. Fake news is not a new phenomenon, and as proof of this, I want to bring up these newspaper clippings. So on the left, we have an ad for an anti-mask meeting. This was around the time of the Spanish flu, and this was in San Francisco in the States. They actually formed an anti-mask league because they found face masks really restrictive on personal liberty, right? And they did this in part because they didn't trust public health authorities and government authorities, and there were limitations placed on what journalists could kind of report on. So all issues that we're pretty familiar with even today, right? On the right, we have a newspaper clipping related to the Russian flu, and it states that, quote, the Russian flu is produced by an entirely new microbe that has been developed by the electric light. So this is from 1889, but I think we can see a lot of parallels to today with fears about technology and the coronavirus, like 5G. So fake news is not new. I think you could actually make a really compelling case that it's always been an important part of human history. Certainly propaganda in the modern era is a huge topic. You know, what is new is the rate at which we're consuming information, especially, you know, during the pandemic, there's so much news coming at us. The ways that technology can amplify false information, and the way that we've replaced a lot of sort of fact-check journalism with hot takes, right? And so that's why this gif of someone scrolling mindlessly, we have a lot more mindless scrolling through social media than we did in 1889. Okay, so the effect of this is to produce a sense of unreality, like we can't know what's real and we can't trust the media. And so I want to counter that harmful narrative with my first tip for you, which is that we can know what's real, and lateral reading is a really quick and effective way to do this. Okay, So to talk about lateral reading, I want to really quickly go over this study that took place at Stanford in 2017. So the researchers Weinberg and McGrew asked study participants to look at these two websites and tell them which one was more credible. So on the left, we have the American Academy of Pediatrics. So they looked at this website. So this is a major professional organization for pediatricians in the US. They have a huge number of members. They're a good, credible source. On the right, we have a splinter group called the American College of Pediatricians, really small number of members, and they are arguably a hate group based off of their position on LGBTQ rights. Okay, so were the participants able to identify which site was more credible? About half of the professional historians failed to identify which site was more credible. About 65% of the Stanford students actually chose the hate site as the more credible one. And I mean, if you look at them, they look very similar, right? They both have this veneer of professionalism. However, 100% of the professional fact checkers identified which site was more credible, and they did so within seconds. So that's amazing. They did this by practicing lateral reading, which means instead of digging deep into the site at hand, lateral readers don't spend time on that page. They immediately get off it and get their bearings by looking for context on other sites and resources elsewhere. So they open up many tabs in their browser. So I can kind of show you exactly what this would look like. So if I search for the American College of Pediatricians, the non-credible site, so I have a link to the site itself that comes up in Google, but then I also have a link to Wikipedia. Not a bad place to get an overview of a topic really quickly. The Southern Poverty Law Center also comes up, so they're a known authority on hate groups. And then two fact-checking sites come up, Snopes and Media Bias Fact Check, which both correctly identified that this is not a credible source. So I think that not reading is sometimes a very effective strategy, and it can be really very powerful because it allows you to make an informed choice on what you want to read, what you want to spend your precious time and energy on. There's a lot of disinformation online, right? And the propagandists who create it want you to read what they have to say. So hate groups are recruiting, anti-vaxxers are recruiting. We have a lot of online toxic communities that really kind of thrive in isolation online. And so by lateral reading, you get context about what they are before you dive in. It allows you to choose where you invest your time. And if you don't even go to the site, like with my example of searching through Google, I could go to those other sites first. I avoid giving them traffic, which they really desperately want and need in order to stay alive. It also allows you to take advantage of the fact that you have a huge amount of contextual information available for you when you're reading online, because you have access to the whole internet right there at your fingertips. So if you're lateral reading, you could also spend time going to a different site that you trust that's reliable, like let's say the CBC, or you could spend your time looking up the author, right? And I really like LinkedIn or organizational websites for checking, okay, what's their education? Where do they work? All right, so my second point is that I want to counter the harmful narrative that all opinions are equally true and valid, right? They are not. And it's really important for us to be able to sort of establish who is actually an authority on a topic and able to write about it. So I think during the pandemic, our politicians in Canada have done a decent job of deferring to public health authorities. So here I have a quotation from Trudeau, who says that politicians shouldn't be opining on COVID-19. And he refers to Canada's Chief Public Health Officer as the person we should turn to. This is in contrast to other places that are not doing this. So this is, at the bottom is a headline from about a week and a half ago. Conservative lawmaker demands White House disband coronavirus task force, where an Arizona senator was asking for this because the health authorities disagreed with the president's authority, right? And that's really kind of problematic because in times like this, we need to defer to people who actually know the health issues at hand. Okay, so what Trudeau was kind of saying with his politicians shouldn't opine on public health issues is he's saying that there are different types of authority, and some of them are appropriate for some situations and some for others, right? So there are three criteria that we normally use to look at authority. So one is their leadership role, like are they a hospital administrator, maybe a community organizer, someone who's elevated within their profession or their community. What's their education? So do they have a relevant graduate degree or medical degree? Anything else? And then what's their practical lived experience? So maybe they've worked for 20 years in the ER, or they've had COVID-19, right? And we can say that authority is constructed and contextual, which really means that you've probably spent time, if you're an authority, constructing your reputation and developing your expertise, right? You've spent time studying this topic in school. It's also contextual, where just because you have 20 years of experience playing the violin, that does not mean that you're an authority on playing the piano, even though they're related fields. And a difficult thing with the pandemic is that with the sciences, these fields can be really highly specific. That's why we need to listen to people who actually have the authority to speak on a topic, and to have our other authority figures, let's say like our political figures, be informed by them. So being able to recognize authority informs us on what we read, so we can't just say, like the Big Lebowski does here, well, that's just like your opinion, man. Right, if your opinion is backed up by contextually relevant leadership, education, or personal experience, it carries more weight, and it's a lot different than if it is not backed up. Oops. Sorry, I was trying to check the chat here, and it's so difficult. Oh well, let's skip ahead one. Okay, so the third tip that I have for you is that I want to acknowledge that our information systems are not neutral, right? I think we often do a good job at recognizing bias in people and in publications, but we don't do as good a job with tech. And technology has bias embedded in it that raises up some information and causes some other information to be hidden or dropped to the bottom. And that's what asymmetric power is. So a really good example of where asymmetric power exists is with YouTube. So YouTube has been shown to disproportionately raise up videos about conspiracy theories, extremism, and other content that provokes outrage. And it does that because its recommendation algorithm is engineered to suggest videos that will keep people watching, and outrage keeps people watching. So this is the case with the video Plandemic, which was put online in May. It features a discredited doctor, which right there, huge red flag for an authority figure. And as the name suggests, it posits that the pandemic was a government-planned conspiracy, right? So it was quickly taken down, but that's kind of where things get really interesting. So some people think that when information is removed from a platform because it's false, that implies that there's something really important there, right? That censorship implies truth. And in this case, for this video, it led to a lot more notoriety for it, and to it sort of becoming entrenched in places on the internet that are free speech absolutists. Even the fact of this video's existence, though, can kind of be considered an issue, because it popularizes the idea that the pandemic was planned. So even though this is nonsense, right, that it's not true at all, there's nothing to it, the idea is out there, and that idea is what will stick in your mind. And it's dangerous for me to even talk about information like this that's been debunked, because sharing debunked information risks spreading it. Which is why if you'll read articles about conspiracy theories like this, the article might quickly go over it and then reiterate, actually, maybe what's important is to wash your hands, practice social distancing, and things like that. That's because the journalist is trying to be responsible and minimally share false information while reiterating correct information. All right, so I've outlined some issues with YouTube, but I don't want to pick on it. There are lots of problems with all of our information systems, and they are really not neutral. So if you're interested in this, I just linked a comprehensive syllabus. That's a great place to go do some reading. And I'll share my slides afterwards. But then I also have a few favorites that I just want to really quickly describe. Okay, so this book, Algorithms of Oppression by Dr. Sophia Noble, talks about how racism and sexism are embedded into Google search. And I think that's important to bring up, especially because with lateral reading, I've recommended that you use a tool like Google in order to gain context. And that's, I think, a really good tip. It's really effective, but I don't want you to go out there and say, I'm going to trust everything that Google gives me implicitly, right? There's really a lot to be gained by being critical of systems like Google and in looking for alternatives where they're available. Maybe a library website, I don't know. All right. Data feminism is just a really good introduction to some of the problems with data collection that we have, right? And how it can marginalize, further marginalize already marginalized groups, data surveillance, issues for the representation, things like that. And then the article on the right from Wikipedia summarizes the criticism it's faced. And I love Wikipedia because they tell on themselves. So this article written by Wikipedians talks about their issues, including, for instance, the fact that most of their editors are men. And so as a result of that, we have a lot of Wikipedia pages about sports statistics and porn stars, but not a lot about midwifery. Okay, so technology is not neutral, which really ties into this next tip, which is kind of my most philosophical one, but I think it's really important, which is that it's impossible for us to get just the facts as divorced from human beings, because human beings are always entangled with information, right? So that happens with technology bias. It also happens with the motivations of propagandists that we kind of have to sift through when we're looking at information. And it relates to the human baggage that we all bring to learning new information, right? So our fears, our motivations, our desires that affect what we perceive and what we take in. So when I go to learn something new, like let's say I'm reading an article about the novel coronavirus, I'm bringing with me everything that I already know about this virus, everything that I know about viruses in general, everything I know about the pandemic, and that, you know, it comes to bear on what I'm able to take in and what I think about it. I'm also bringing with me my own identity, right? So if I'm afraid that I'm going to get sick, or I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, which are both very kind of rational fears and real fears, that affects what I'm able to take in and how I perceive things as well. And so because of this, I might practice sort of irrational strategies, as we often do with information. We are not rational with it, like confirmation bias, which is where I'm going to seek out information that confirms what I already think. And that's because that might make me feel better, right, about overcoming my fears. I might also practice something called information avoidance. So this happens all the time with health information, financial information, things that are kind of difficult and tricky, where I'm going to avoid taking information that could be upsetting. So that's where with COVID, maybe you don't recognize your own symptoms because you don't want to acknowledge what's happening. With financial information, it would be not opening bills because you don't want to see what's in there, right? And we're kind of hopefully continuing some sort of semblance of normalcy these days, but things are not normal. We're still in a time of trauma, sort of uncertainty and fear, and that really has to affect how we take in information. All right, so the final tip that I have for you is that research is challenging. And I can say this as a librarian who helps everyone from undergraduates to faculty with their research challenges. We all face them. There are just some sort of inherently difficult parts about research that get easier with time, but they might never be easy, like synthesizing complex information. It's just hard. And then when I say research is hard, I also include non-academic work in that. So reading the news and trying to learn about the world that we live in is hard, ongoing, lifelong work. And I feel the need to say this because it flies in the face of a lot of what we're continually being told by private information companies, right? Like Google, where its message is really the opposite, that research is easy. Everything you need is only a click away. And it tells us this through its nice clean interface, through public statements that it's neutral, and in the way it markets itself as an answer machine. So I think it's actually kind of a harmful narrative that we have to know everything in the speed of time that it takes to Google it, because that prevents us from doing the difficult work of becoming informed. I'm a teacher, and it's much more difficult to teach someone who thinks they already know everything than someone who's open to learning new information. So here's where I would kind of challenge you to ask yourself, what are you an authority on? Where have you spent time with your education and learning and experience? And then where are you not an authority and you don't have all the answers, right? And I'll start. So I can say, and I'll change slides because that one's so distracting. So I can say, I don't have all the answers about coronavirus. As a result of that, I need to listen to epidemiologists and other authorities in order to get an informed opinion. And when I read newspaper articles, I need to follow that up by doing my homework and finding out where they got their facts, right? What experts are they quoting? Where's their information coming from? And I can kind of demand this information from my public officials as well. Similarly, I am a white Canadian. I do not have the lived experience of a Black American, right? So when I'm taking information about the Black Lives Matter protests in the States, I need to be open to hearing about Black experiences, to learn about similar issues happening in Canada, and to kind of break down those barriers that keep me from hearing that information, right? So this kind of reflective work breaks down your ego. And in everything that I've read about fake news, conspiracy theories, what draws people to the anti-vax movement, it's ego, right? So the idea that you know best, you can outsmart the government and all those other sheeple, ego plays a really huge role in sort of reinforcing your confidence in your ability to know what the truth is. So normalize saying, I don't know, but I can find out. Right? And you can find out by lateral reading and by looking to proper authorities. You can also work on your daily habits. I think this is really important because when you get stressed out and you get into a place where you can't take in new information, right? You're coronavirus out, you'll have these to kind of rely on. And we could all probably find ways to work on our daily habits. Everyone, doesn't matter if you think you already have strong habits, there's probably something. And your habits might be different than these. These are just a few I thought might be relevant. So if you were to say, I don't know how to identify media bias, which comes up sometimes when I talk to students, read different newspapers and compare coverage, right? So if you're a current student or a faculty member, we have really great coverage here at the library. For alumni, the public library is really good access too. If you're saying, I don't know enough about Indigenous issues and COVID, follow community leaders, Indigenous journalists and experts, right? Then you can kind of take things in passively while you're on social media. Or if you want to, if your issue is that you want to learn more about disease, but you don't have a science background, try a podcast. You can listen to it while you go for a walk or do something to relax. These are my recommendations. I really like This Podcast Will Kill You. It's all about disease. And they do a really good job of modeling the I don't know, but I'll find out. And then just my final thing is if your issue is that you're feeling overwhelmed, it's also okay to take a break from news because reading the news is work, becoming informed is work. Come back to it when you're able to do that work and kind of think critically because mindless scrolling helps no one. That's it. Thanks.
Wow, Lisa, thank you so much. So many amazing tips and ways in which we could identify fake news and perhaps seek the truth. Lots of questions in the Q&A and a couple that have come another way. So let's just dive in. So here's a good question. How would you suggest that one convinces someone else that they've actually read fake news?
Oh yeah. I mean, that one's, tough. So one thing that doesn't work is calling someone an idiot or undermining their concerns. So that's kind of shown in the literature about the anti-vax movement, because we've had anti-vaxxers for a really long time. What might work, as suggested by the literature, is to try to understand someone's concerns, to work with them on that. So you can say, like, I understand that, you know, maybe you're scared, right? A lot of people are scared for their children and the health of their kids, right? And it's only once you're on kind of an equal footing that you understand that you can then steer them towards better authorities. And people tend to trust their family doctors in Canada. So steer them towards them as a good source.
Great. Here's a question about lack of content or bias. How does one distinguish between fake news and bias in content? In other words, missing information. Are they in and one the same, meaning to tell the whole story or just share a complete picture? What is your take on that? And what are some of the good sites that one could use for fact checking?
Sure. I like Snopes. They do a really good job of fact checking. They employ fact checkers on site. And so if you're reading something, maybe it's been out for a few days and it's kind of had time to percolate, you can go to Snopes, type it in, and then say, is it true that people have been having COVID-19 parties? And they'll have an answer often. As for the question of how can you tell what's totally false versus what has bias, probably everything has bias built into it in some way, right?
Right.
And what you consider bias is going to be based on your own beliefs about what's true or not. Like, I could be said to have a pro-science bias, which I don't really mind. But as for telling whether or not something is purely poorly regarded, lateral reading, right? If you're reading something and you can Google the name of the site and you find 10 other sites that tell you this place normally publishes false information, then you can kind of step back and be skeptical.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. And the notion of lateral reading is also quite powerful for not just identifying fake news, but probably validating news already that we all subscribe to or believe in, which is really great. Here's another question about world leaders. And if a world leader is talking about fake news and the public is supposed to trust leaders, how do we then curb some of the work that they're doing or some of the statements that they're making with other opinions or facts that are out there?
Yeah.
It's a big one.
Because I think it is really problematic when you have a public health official, or a public figure like Donald Trump, who regularly shares misinformation because they're in a position of so much traditional authority, right? The role of the President of the United States has so much weight to it. I think acknowledging that different types of authority exist, right? So if you look at his background, he does not have the ability to speak on health issues. Whereas maybe other public leaders also don't have that background, but you know that they're reading their briefings, and they have a proven track record of maybe not deviating from, good advice. Right? The nice thing with our public leaders is that they're subject to a lot of public scrutiny by the free press, the same way that our health officials and scientists are subject to scrutiny, which is good. I always think that if you have proper authority, you can face all the scrutiny, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This is, we only have time for one more question. It has to be a quick one around paid media. And if someone can pay to espouse fake news and it hits, the first two lines of our Google search or whatever search engine we're using, how do we curb some of the information or some of the content that we're served up, so to speak. In, just as we were going about our everyday and curiosity around what's happening in the world, but even just, mundane things around perhaps where to order food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say, yeah, so being critical of Google's good. A lot of people don't even kind of recognize or know that often the first result you'll get is a paid ad. And Dr. Noble says, like from the book that I referenced, one of the best ways we can think of Google is actually as an advertising company, because they make about 70% of their revenue, which is billions upon billions of dollars directly from advertisers, right? So I think if you change your mindset about what you're encountering, then you can use it in a more critical way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Lisa, we've run out of time. We could go on for another hour for sure with all of the questions and all the ideas that you've shared with us today. So I want to thank you so much for sharing them with us today, this afternoon. And we need to have you back, clearly. There's more to discuss.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. And for all of you that have joined us this afternoon, thank you for making the time. We look forward to inviting you back for more information and thoughtful content from our Ryerson family in the coming days and weeks. Please stay tuned. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you want to watch this webinar again or share it with your friends, colleagues, family, and networks, please watch out for an email from us in the next few days. Thank you again, Lisa. Have a great afternoon. And thank you all for being here. Talk soon. Bye for now.